All right, everyone, learn some MVC.
All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen.
Yep.
So today I'm going to be doing a basic introduction to MVC3. I labeled my title, I thought just exemplified how I feel about it, or how I learned to stop worrying and learn how to love the framework. This makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside to discuss this topic with everyone today. So a little bit about myself. My name is Benjamin Evans. I'm an ASP.NET developer here at PragmaticWorks. I'm also a Peter Sellers lookalike. It's just a little hobby of mine. You know, no weird thing about that at all. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about MVC. So I kind of wanted to give an overview of what we're going to be discussing today. So what I would like to begin with is just kind of provide a gentle introduction to what MVC is exactly and why you may be interested in using it, or maybe why you wouldn't be interested in using it. But primarily what I wanted to focus on today is what cool new features are included in the new version 3. And going over some of the cool new features like the new Razor View engine and some of the new page helper methods, and just kind of discussing some of the new functionality that is frankly pretty awesome. And also at the end of the session I also provide some direction and maybe some tutorials and more information, so if you're interested in learning more, I'd love to share some potential places you can start looking. So let's go ahead and start with what is MVC. So MVC stands for Model View Controller. Sorry, one second. Stands for Model View Controller. It's basically a framework to structurally format the way information is passed throughout your application, or in a way that's easy to distinguish what piece is doing what. Of course, this is one of many different patterns available for use. And this is just, it's been around for a long time, and people have found it very useful, very clear and concise. A little bit of a learning curve compared to maybe traditional ASP.NET forms. It's a little bit different thinking, but once you get used to it, once you see how it works, you realize that it provides a very clear and concise place for each of your information. So let's break it down. So the model. Our model is our container of information. In the model, we build out our business logic. We build out our containers of business logic, or our structures for business logic, which would be something like a customer object. A customer has a first name, a last name, an email address. The model contains that information that is the attribute of a customer. Now the view. The view is the display structure for displaying models' data. So the view takes the information from the model and presents it. The controller sits sort of in the middle, and what the controller does is it takes model information, ensures that business rules have been followed, and then pushes it onto the view. And if you kind of look at the kind of the flow in the model here, let me see if I can get a pen. If you kind of look at the model, or the little graph I have displaying, you can kind of see that there's a workflow that takes place. So information generally comes from the model, or the controller calls the database or whatever, populates the model, and then passes it into the view, where the user interface, or the user interacts with the model as displayed in the view, changes the information, does whatever to it, and then it's passed, whatever interaction they have with the model is then populated and then sent back to the controller for the most part, where the controller decides what logic to handle with it. So let's talk about. Actually, I want to show you a little example here. This is one of the examples that you can find on code spaces, and this is kind of where I'm going to be pulling a lot of the sample code and showing you kind of how it works. It's called the MVC Music Store. If you haven't seen it before, you should definitely check it out. It has a full 160-page tutorial on how to develop from scratch for the most part, and it'll take you through everything. And I'll give you some of the I'll give you the information to find it at the end. But it provides a bunch of cool features, so we're going to kind of walk through how this works. But let's kind of go over it. So it's basically just a storefront for a music store. And on the side we have a way we can select and filter down the different types of music. We can select a particular album and then add it to our cart, remove it, and so forth. And then we can also go in. We have already have a built-in login system, which I'm already happen to be logged in, in which we can actually go in and edit the information for our business. So we can go in and say and edit, and then change the genre, the artist, so forth. So it's a cool little application that it's great getting started and kind of shows you the inner workings of MVC. So why would you use MVC? Why would you take the layered approach, I guess you would say? Why would you use this versus a traditional WinForms, or ASP.NET Forms? And it actually kind of varies based on your needs. The biggest difference, or the biggest plus for MVC, is you've eliminated the view state. If you're not familiar with the view state in ASP.NET, the view state generally contains all the sort of particular information of an instance of a page that is running, so that when the information posts back to the server, it kind of knows where it is and has sort of the information related to it. And if you've ever looked at the view state in an ASP.NET page, sometimes it can get pretty hefty, and it actually can take quite a toll on your performance. Well, MVC doesn't have the view state naturally built in. There are ways you can hack into it and build that back into it, but natively it doesn't contain a view state, so it has a huge performance boost. Another plus thing about MVC is that it provides you, for the most part, you have all the controls that you would normally have in ASP.NET. Even though it's a separate system, it's sort of designed differently and it looks differently, it's still built on top of ASP.NET. All the fundamentals are still there. Sometimes you have to do a little hacking to make things work. It's not always as easy as a drag and a drop, but it's still, everything behind the scenes is still the same. It's still ASP.NET. One of the downsides with MVC is sometimes you really don't need it. Sometimes the job works just fine in an ASP.NET page. If you're fully comfortable in ASP.NET and you're able to get the job done, sometimes, hey, that may work out fine for you. That may be, there may be no need to move something to a little bit more complicated, such as MVC. So MVC can be really good for those little bit larger scale projects that you may have more complicated things going on. Okay, so let's discuss a little bit about some of the changes. In MVC 3. So there's been a couple of major changes. The two biggest ones, there's tons of little changes, little structural changes, and I wish I could go over them all. But the two major ones, and first, my biggest one, my big fave, is the new Razor View engine. The new Razor View engine, basically they rebuilt the traditional methods. I don't know if you've ever done ASP.NET programming before, but you used to have to do the little brackets and the squirrely things, and sometimes it would make your page really dense with all the little things to kind of inject the code into the page to make things work. With the new Razor View engine, it's very clean, it's very concise, it's very pretty to look at, and being someone that stares at it a lot, it's very nice to have nice, clean, easily visible code, or kind of intermixed with your HTML and be able to easily tell where it begins and ends without cluttering everything up. Also with the Razor View engine, it also they added a cool feature called the View Start. And the View Start is a little snippet of code that runs before any page loads, and you've always sort of had it in ASP.NET, but it kind of made it really easy in this particular scenario, and all the previous versions of MVC didn't have it natively built in which you can kind of logically control where things are going to be sent to, like perhaps your view page or your master page in MVC. You can now easily control and direct where it leads to, whereas before it would require a little bit of a hack job, to be honest. So that's a cool little feature. Also, another neat feature is the unobtrusive Ajax. What that is basically it natively built in. They natively built in a way to pass on annotations of your model, which is say that this is a required field, or that this information has to be between this length and that length, so your database will take it, or for whatever business need. You can easily annotate that information on your model in code, and then automatically just sort of push it to the front end to jQuery. So jQuery actually handles it for you. So all that JavaScript script is automatically written in just a few simple lines of code, and that's a pretty neat thing. And on top of that, they also added a few view helper classes. For instance, they added a new charting class, so you can create charts and things really easy by just passing a model of an array of models, perhaps, and defining what kind of dimensions you're building it on, and the chart automatically populates for you using MS Charts and some of the new jQuery stuff. Also, there's a new crypto class, an easy web grid class. That's pretty neat, as well as a web image builder, and some webmail functions that easily kind of handle all the behind-the-scenes stuff with webmail, kind of make it a little bit simpler. All right, so let's take a look at some code, shall we? Let me pull up my browser. Okay, so going back to our original, let me actually pull this up. Going back to our original idea, so as you can see here on the right side, you see my project file, which is the MVC Music Store. Everything's broken down in pretty much the traditional format, but it sort of has pre-built buckets for everything. First one we have here, the first major one we have is the content bucket. Here we store our images and our theme files, which is all the jQuery theming information, as well as our CSS. In our controllers is where we have our actual controllers that control all of our information, and actually right here is our home controller. We also have our models, which contain all the information, the structural information for populating our views. Scripts, just our JavaScripts. Our view models, and finally our views. And this is actually, you'll notice that this view right here has the abbreviation CS_HTML, which is our actual new Razor format. So let's take a look at, since we're at the home controller, I'm going to take a look at index. So this is our index page. As you can see, that there's obviously some HTML mixed in here. As you can see, there's a div promotion and all this. And if you look right here, you'll notice the little @ sign with the for each. So when you append the @ sign, it actually takes you into sort of a C# mode, and it allows you to begin writing the C# code as you would normally do in an ASPX page without having to do the brackets. So if you take a look at it, it's actually very clean. It's very nice. It automatically sort of determines your open and start brackets. You don't have to worry about the details of when it closes and when it opens. It knows the syntax of C#, so it knows basically when you're beginning and end, and for some reason, should it get it confused, there's easy ways to break it out of that. As you can see here, we're creating a URL action to a specific item. So you see URL, which is one of our helper methods. The action is the location, and it automatically builds the routing information and kind of spits it out as a URL. So you don't have to worry. So should it change, rather, it has all that stuff sort of built in for you already. So really easy to embed stuff in the page. For instance, like the album title, which is coming from the view, or the model, this page's model, excuse me. And cool. So let's kind of, let's start from the model. We'll actually discuss where to begin with this. All right, let me go back to the models. And as you can see here, we're going to go, I want to take a look at the album and take a look at this. Okay. So this is our model. Like I was discussing earlier, it contains basic properties of what an album is. There's not really any code per se. It's merely just a structure in the pure sense of the word. As you can see, we have these annotations on top that signify, for instance, the display name is telling the front end when it reaches the view. It looks for the display name, and that's how it attaches it to the genre object, which can be found here. So we're basically telling it that we want to attach to a genre object. And here's another one. I was always talking about validation can be built in right on top of the models. We're saying that we're making this field required, and then if it's for some reason not present when it's submitted, that we want to throw this error message, and that we also want it to have a string length, our maximum string length of 160 characters. All right, so another instance here of required and all that. So you kind of see the idea here. So let's also take a look at the controller. All right, so when the page is routed, let me pull the page back up. Click home. Since this is home.default, we've sort of, there's a configuration file that you can say which your home page is. But in this case, it's going to be home.index or home/index. And as you can see, that we're getting the top 5 albums down here at the bottom. And what basically happens when this page loads is first it checks the routing information. In this case, since it's the default page, it's going to go home./index. It's going to pull that information by calling the action in the controller. So the index will be called. We want to get the top 5 selling albums. So we want the top 5 selling albums. So we call the database store, which is actually in this case is using Entity Framework. I actually did a webinar on the Entity Framework if you're interested in learning a little bit more about it. But in this case, we're pulling our data from a database through the Entity Framework, calling the top 5 albums, passing it to a list, and getting it back as a undetermined variable, and then passing that to the view. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, back to our view. If you take a look up here, we've defined that our model is going to be a list of MVC Music Store models.album, which is back from where we started originally. And that we want to loop through each one of them as a list item and stick them on the page, which gives us ultimately these 5 items down here, just as it was specified in the controller. So now let's talk about the next big topic, which is posting information, or actually not just grabbing information and displaying it, but receiving information. All right, so if we take a look up here, this is actually a great view of the the routing information. So you can see everything here has a meaning to it. This is the general built-in routing controller, or the routing setup. So right here, first you'll see the actual controller that we're looking for. So the actual main controller class that we're looking to be called, which in this case is store manager, which action that we want the controller to do, and this is an extra variable, which in this case we're looking for item with the ID 1. So instead of a query string, we actually built it into the URL. So let's take a look at that route in the actual code. All right. So let's start off with store manager. So this is our store manager controller. You'll notice that all the controllers have their abbreviation controller. MVC automatically kind of removes that controller title at the end and just pays attention to this. So if you type in store manager, it looks for that everything except for the controller section of it. So it sort of automatically removes that. If you worked with MVC before, that hasn't changed. We also, it was the edit action. So let's go down to the edit action, which happens to be right here. Let me scroll in a little bit here. So hopefully you guys can see. Okay, cool. So the edit action and the ID, which is passed as is actually it right here, as passed as the last item. So we're calling the database to find whatever matches that ID and return it. We want to create a select list, which is one of our view objects that we're passing, which is just that select dropdown, which is going to be genres. We want our value to equal genre ID, or the genre ID field. We want it to actually show the name, but we want it to bind on the genre ID from the album, because we want that one to be selected, in other words. Okay, once we add all that information, we're going to pass that album to the view state, or to our view, I should say. And this is a cool feature built in. Go to view. And we're going to pass that to our view. So if you go back up here, you can look and see that we're looking at an album and that the title is edit. Okay, so let's take a look right here. And you'll notice right here that we're going to start using our, once again, using our HTML helper classes. What we're doing is we're creating a form, just a regular good old-fashioned form post between the open and close brackets, which is done with a Razor View Engine. So once these fields are populated, what'll basically happen is the user will hit submit or whatever, and it'll do a good old-fashioned HTTP post back to our controller. So we'll actually come back to that and how it returns in just a moment, but it's pretty cool, just basic HTTP. So right here at top, we're just going to show the summary. Now, let's talk about binding labels or any kind of controls to the actual model object, so that when the user enters the information, hits submit, that whatever's in that contained within that field automatically is populated into our model. Say they change their first name from John to Bob, that change is reflected into the model that is returned back. So it's done with just calling the HTML label for. We create our, we reference our model, and we say model.genre ID. And we bind the genre to our genre ID to our label in this case. So that's what will appear. And as you can see, that same kind of method follows. It's really easy to quickly create and bind labels. Also, you'll see right here that there's an HTML validation message for, excuse me, can't talk today, which which is actually binding the return message response, as I was talking about the annotations on the models. It'll actually, for some reason, if it's not valid, it'll return that information to that class, so you can specify where the error message is displayed. Cool, and then finally just a simple submit button. So let's see where it gets sent to. Back to the store controller. And so here's our initial, this is our get, by the way. So this is our simple get that happens with the page call. And then, as you can see here, there's an HTTP post abbreviation to the top of this method, which is telling MVC, hey, this is a post, simply. And pretty awesome. What you get back directly is an album object. So I am going to put a breakpoint in. Go ahead and run it. Get our edit screen back. I'm going to click Save. So we hit a breakpoint. Now let's take a look at our album. Hopefully you guys can see it. But if you can't, what's basically happened is we've gotten back our object fully populated with what was selected. So we get our artist ID, our genre ID, a price, whatever information we change is handed back to us. Go ahead and end that. All right, cool. So what's basically happened is it's checking to see if it's valid or not. It's saving the changes back to Entity Framework, and then it's redirecting to the index page. And if it fails, it rebinds everything and says, hey, try again, which is what the is valid state automatically calls. So cool. All right. Let's talk a little bit more about the view start, as I mentioned earlier. This little snippet of code, this was also something I wanted to quickly share with you. Originally, this is a new feature. Although you can, in the global ASCX, you can create some code to run before each page loads. This provides a neat way that, unless you were doing it in traditional ASP.NET, that you had no built-in method to easily run some code. So now I can set my layout to whatever I wish. Based on the routing information or whatever, I can change so the users see different things based on their routes or whatever, or however creative you want to get with it. Cool. All right. And one more thing I wanted to show. Actually, just to kind of step back a little bit, another thing I wanted to mention, a new feature in MVC3. As you can see here, we can specify an HTTP post. We can pass in objects and albums and such. One of the cool new features in MVC3 is you don't have to necessarily do it through a traditional form post anymore. Now you can also pass it as JSON. So for instance, let's take a look back at our page. Oops, I killed it before it opened. If we take a look back at our page, for instance, say we didn't want to do a traditional HTTP post. Say if we wanted to do some custom Ajax implementation of this simple form. Say we had 3 different things that were going on and we had just to do it one specific way. So we created a jQuery Ajax post that grabbed all of the genre information and so forth and created a JSON object and then pushed it to our controller using the traditional Ajax post. Well, before MVC3, you would have to build a custom binder, a custom model binder, inherit the model binder class, and then define all the specifics to what fields you were looking for each particular model. So you would have to go in and basically almost parse the information yourself sort of. One of the cool new features is implemented now is there's an automatic deserialization feature. So if I pass JSON to the controller as an HTTP post, it automatically deserializes it into an actual album object for me. No fancy footwork for me, no extra coding to build the model binder or anything like that. It sort of all does it for me. It can be a little bit on the word of caution with that. It can be a little bit funny sometimes because it has to be very clean and specific, so you have to play around with it to get the JSON just right so where it can easily bind. But if you have the model match exactly with the model in the actual model class, it's a piece of cake. It just automatically finds everything and binds it to it. You can have nested classes. It's amazing. Alrighty. So, just quickly looking over, actually, right. Sorry, I'm having mouse issues. So back to where we were. So also there's the unobtrusive Ajax, which I don't have a demonstration for, but I definitely recommend checking out. It's pretty amazing, some of the cool little features that can be added with that. And the fact that you can quickly and easily just kind of go in and build all the JavaScript, and it's not, generally when I hear of code injecting JavaScript or injecting some kind of extra weight into a page that I don't specify, usually I kind of cringe a little bit. But one of the cool things about unobtrusive Ajax is it actually is very clean. It's very lightweight, or at least much more than you generally encounter. So it generally runs really fast unless you get really carried away with it. It's very smooth. It's very clean, like I mentioned earlier. It's pretty amazing. I definitely recommend checking it out. So I also want to talk about where you can find some more information on MVC. The MVC store, music store tutorial, which is what I was using to demonstrate some of the basic coding today, can be found on CodeSpaces. Actually, I might be able to pull it up for you. No, I don't still have it up. But you can find it on CodeSpaces. I definitely highly recommend it if you're interested in learning MVC to download this tutorial and just kind of walk through it. It has, like I said, it comes with a 160-page PDF that takes you step by step through a lot of it and shows you all the cool functionality and some of the interfaces and classes where you can build and expand on MVC. That's another great thing about MVC. It's very expandable based on your needs. Another great source, if you're an ASP.NET developer and already don't know who Scott Hanselman is, shame on you. But Hanselman.com, if I could just learn half the things that he knows, I would be a happy developer, and especially about MVC. So he is another great resource. And also I'm going to post just a nice list of resources to learn MVC on my blog, which is located, okay, here we go, at bidn.com/people/bevans. So hopefully for the end of the day I'll have all those resources as well as any additional questions posted to BIDN. And also, if you have any specific questions or anything, or you would like me to go into more detail, feel free to email me at bevans@pragmaticworks.com. And if you have any complaint mail, feel free to send it to Rachel Madison.
Great, thank you.
So I guess let's go ahead and go into the questions, if that's cool. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. We have two questions. One is model is a database CSV-XML with data. That is the question. I am not exactly sure what you mean, Shikar, but if you could clarify. I think he's asking whether the model is a database CSV XML file.
Oh, okay.
Pretty sure he's asking.
Let me see if I can. Oh, was he asking if the database was an XML file?
Right, or CSV, or...
In this case, it's actually it comes with a SQL compact database, but you can easily push it. Since it's using an entity framework, you can easily push it in any direction you want. When you're building, one of the cool things about .NET, you still have the whole .NET framework behind you, so you can basically pull data from anywhere you want. If you need to pull it from XML, you can use an XML deserializer or serializer and pull it as objects, or you can create your own custom implementation to pull it. The reason they use SQL Compact for this particular demonstration was because it's easy mobile. Just kind of plug it in there and send it off, and don't have to worry about someone having SQL Server installed and building them, having to restore the database and all that. You do have to download the SQL CE driver, well, DBC driver. Hopefully that answered your question.
I'm pretty sure it did. So we're going to move on. If you have any more follow-ups to that, you can just type it in the question box. Leonard would like to know, where is your database access layer code stored?
Okay. Yeah, let me actually pull that up. A lot of it is actually, since we're using an entity framework, there's actually not a lot to show. We're actually using LINQ for all of our calls. Let me see if I can find a good example. Right here is actually creating our database object, if you will, which is called Music Store Entities. And that database object, we can, since we're using it through entity framework, we basically do all of our querying through LINQ. Let me show you a good example of actual LINQ code, or actual good query. Here we go, actually. If you take a look right here, so storedb.carts, so we're looking for our carts table, and we're saying where cart ID is equal to shopping cart ID, and then we're pushing all those to a list. And the cool thing about Entity Framework, I definitely recommend sitting through a little bit of my webinar on Entity Framework.
Nice plug.
Yeah, you know. What it's going to do for you is it's going to take your table row items and basically just create a model for you and then pump it out to you, pre-populated, so you don't have to worry about actually doing the hydration or anything like that. So we're doing all of our querying through LINQ. We're doing our hydration through Entity Framework. It's really nice and simple.
Okay, great. Jeff has a question. Is there an easy way to set up a file using MVC, to handle uploading one or more pictures for an album instead of just putting in the path?
Okay, one more time for me.
Is there an easy way to set up a file uploading using MVC, to handle uploading one or more pictures for an album instead of just putting in the path?
That is a good question.
Way to go, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, as of right now, at least the way it's demonstrated, so let's go back to the way it's demonstrated, is it's assuming that the image is already there, so there's no upload apparatus for it. But I'll actually have to go find it. I'm going to write that down. There's actually a pretty cool little tool that you can use in JavaScript that will sort of will create that multiple uploader. And like I mentioned earlier, you can use JSON. You can post JSON back to the controller, or you can actually just kind of embed it in a hidden field or something with your post, where that you could have all the URLs. So you could post the information using JavaScript to your server, using any tool available, really, and then take those URLs and then place it in your post. I'll find that tool for you, and maybe a good example on how to use it, and I'll post it on my blog.
Okay, he's clarifying now, not URLs, but local files.
Right.
Okay. Stay tuned to Den's blog, Jeff.
Yeah, the actual posting It works a little bit different to actually get it on the server. But yeah, I'll post a good example of that on my blog.
Okay, great. We have another question. Can you show how the routing is handled?
The actual routing?
Yeah, routing.
Yeah.
There we go.
So, routing, that's fantastic.
Thank you. I do what I can.
So if you take a look, I'm going to jump into our global ASCX page. And there is a little section of code called register routes. The first one here is telling us to ignore AXD routing information, which is sort of some back-end generated files for JavaScript and stuff that kind of helps facilitate generally third-party controllers and some built-in controllers. So it just says forget about it. Okay, but here, map routes is where we're actually defining our map, our routing information. As you see, it's pretty clear here. So we're creating a route name, or we're setting up our actual URL parameters. So right here we have the controller, and it's all text, which is both sometimes the bane and the cool flexibility feature, I guess you could say, and it's actually parsing it. So right here we're saying we want our first part of the URL to be our controller, our second part to be the action, and our third part to be the ID. And we could create any number of different things with that. So I could create another one that said controller.action. Some kind of random name like username / anything basically, and we can pass that information in. So it's very flexible. You can build a route for every specific circumstance that you would need, and for the most part it'll actually generally route that for you pretty well. In this case, we're just finding our default, so like I mentioned earlier, how it automatically routed us to home.index every time we loaded our page. We're defining that right here in our parameters, so we're saying, you know, our controller is going to default to home, our action is going to default to index, and our ID is maybe be there, maybe not. Hopefully that answered your question.
I believe it did. If not, you can post a follow-up. So we have another question. They're asking for you to show them exactly where they can find the sample on code spaces. A couple of people are having a little difficulty finding it.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Let me pull it up real fast here on the side. I have it right here. Alrighty. Sorry about the wait.
Well, while we're waiting for you to pull it up, how about we answer another question?
All right, let's do it.
Is it possible to pass encoded parameters with the help of routers?
Encoded parameters. Can you be a little bit more specific?
Can you clarify, David? That would be wonderful. Okay, we have another question.
Okay.
Let's see. Can we use ASP.NET user control in MVC?
ASP.NET user controls. Yes and no. There are ways to make it work, because like I mentioned earlier, it's just the it's still ASP.NET, still the ASP.NET framework sitting behind the scenes. Now, unfortunately, some of the front-end stuff they've altered, and they've kind of rerouted the way it works. So so it's not as easy as it used to be, but there are ways to make it work.
Maybe that's something else you can post your blog on.
Yeah, it's like something that's easier to show by example, I guess. I guess you could say. It is possible. I will say that much. Sometimes it's more frustrating to not do it, but so most of the time, personally, I don't generally try to use existing web controls, and I generally write my own specific MVC since there's sort of an architectural difference. But yeah, like I said, it's still ASP.NET. It's still possible to make it work.
Okay. Jeff would like to know, how does an edit handle child classes? I'm referring to, say, additional options for the same product, which would add additional cost to the product.
Right. You know, that's one of the features that can get kind of complex when you have nested children objects or nested child sort of parameters. That's when the JSON comes real useful. Since there's no way to inherently, HTML isn't built in a way to easily generate child objects, since there's no way to post that kind of parameter information, because traditional post, I don't know if you've ever looked at it, it's just like kind of like a query string, kind of just sent in a sort of different way. But there's no inherent way to say that this is an array object or that there's child objects hidden within. So it sort of creates a technical difficulty doing the traditional post method. But since we now have the new JSON deserializer automatically built in, what I generally do in those situations is when the person hits submit, I build the object in JSON, and then I post it to the controller as a JSON object, and then redirect it, or whatever, so forth. It does require the users have JavaScript, which is kind of can be an issue with some people, but generally not. We haven't found it to be a huge issue.
Okay, great. Here's another one. How can I pass multiple arguments to a view? For example, ID and name, just like having multiple values in query strings.
So that takes us back right here, actually, in the map route. In those situations, what you do is you'd create a new route specific to whatever parameters that you need passed in that situation. So for instance, if you were looking for both user ID and account ID or whatever to specify a specific account, you would use you would create a route specific to that, and you would call that route. Actually, I take it back. Actually, generally it'll find it on its own. I'll direct you to. There's a great article on routing. I'll add it to the resources that Scott Guthrie did a post on. It's MVC2, but since the routing engine's pretty much the same, I'll add that to the blog. That goes over it in detail. There's a lot of different things you can do with the routing engine, and it's actually pretty neat.
Okay, great. We have another question from David.
Okay.
Let's say for some security reasons I don't want to show my user IDs to an end user. How could I do this?
User IDs to an end user. What I would generally do, one method you could possibly do is change your view model and then post it in a hidden field to carry the state across pages. Another possibility is that you could create some kind of like a grid or some kind of unique ID or some kind of temporary ID and save it in a session for that specific instance. There's a bunch of different ways you can do that. So if you needed to use that traditional routing, you could, like I said earlier, you could create a GUID or something instead of the user ID, and then save the relationship in the session. Or yeah, you could just post it in the traditional way. Sorry, it's getting lunchtime for me, and my mouth is falling asleep. I don't know, but hopefully that makes sense to you.
Okay, we have several more questions, but I think we only have time for a couple more. So
Okay.
one is, can I have plugins for controllers and views?
Plugins for controller and views. Yes, actually you can. There's tons of cool plugins like I know DevExpress has some MVC specific plugins and controls. I don't know if you mean by like that in the actual controller or in the view. I'm assuming you mean in the view, kind of like the traditional drag and drop kind of controls. Telerik has some pretty neat controls. There's As MVC gets bigger, I think you'll see a lot more, and there's tons of open source stuff. But pretty much every flavor you can think of, yeah, there's specific to MVC architecture controls. So yeah, it's available out there.
They're out there.
They're out there.
That's good. And we actually have a question for me, crazy enough. Yes, this webinar has been recorded, and it will be posted by the end of the week. So check back if you missed anything or if you had to join late. And I think that's all we have time for today. If you have any more questions, feel free to email Ben. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah. Take care.